This chapter is about standard costs and variances. First, let's find out what a standard cost is and how they're developed. A standard cost is just a budget for a single unit of product. What we use this is as a benchmark for evaluating actual costs. So again, we're going to use standard cost in our performance evaluation. There are two types of standards. You get ideal or perfection standards. Typically, these standards do not allow for any inefficiencies. So for example, if I give you an exam that has 40 questions and I expect you to complete that in 40 minutes, that would be an ideal standard. I would assume that you would know all your material, that you have instant recall, and that you do not read the question over again or think about it, that you would read the question, instantly know the answer, and move on. That would be an example of an ideal or perfection standards. Do not allow for any inefficiency. But typically, we don't talk about ideal standards. We always talk about practical or attainable standards. These allow for normal amounts of waste and inefficiency. Going back to the exam again, if it's an exam with 40 questions, it would be practical to allow everybody to have 55 minutes or an hour to do a 40-minute exam. That gives you enough time to read, think about it, erase an answer if you make a mistake, but still be efficient about it. It's a normal amount of waste and inefficiency as opposed to ideal standards. So whenever we are talking about standard costs in the upcoming discussion, we are always dealing with practical or attainable standards. Whenever companies develop products, they make sure their standard costs allow for a normal amount of waste and inefficiency. So the standards that they develop, again, are practical or attainable standards. And these are the standards that they use to benchmark against actual costs for evaluating performance. How do companies develop standards? They use past usage of material and labor. They look at the current cost of inputs. And then, of course, once you've developed your standards, you need to update these for future changes. So if anything changes, you do need to update your standard cost. We're going to learn how to calculate the standard cost of direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. You'll see later that manufacturing overhead will be split into variable manufacturing overhead and fixed manufacturing overhead. You'd probably want to write these formulas down and bring them to class, but a lot of them is pretty much common sense. So for standard cost calculation for direct materials is calculated by multiplying the standard quantity of direct material multiplied by the standard price of direct material, which is the standard cost of direct material. For direct labor, it's the standard quantity of direct labor multiplied by the standard price of direct labor. That gives you the standard cost of direct labor. For calculating the standard cost for manufacturing overhead, it is a two-step process. Let's take variable manufacturing overhead. You start off by calculating a variable manufacturing overhead rate, which is, by the way, very similar to your predetermined manufacturing overhead rate. You take your total estimated variable manufacturing overhead, you divide that by total estimated amount of the allocation base, and that gives you your variable manufacturing overhead rate. And then, to figure out what your standard variable manufacturing overhead is, you multiply the variable manufacturing overhead rate you just calculated by the standard quantity of allocation base. To calculate the standard fixed manufacturing overhead per unit, you do the same process, but this time you're going to take the fixed manufacturing overhead rate. So first step is to calculate a fixed manufacturing overhead rate, which you do by dividing total estimated fixed manufacturing overhead cost divided by total estimated amount of the allocation base. Once you do that, you get a fixed manufacturing overhead rate, and then to calculate the standard fixed manufacturing overhead rate per unit, you multiply the rate you just calculated by the standard quantity of allocation base. Again, this is a very similar formula to your predetermined overhead rate and then allocating manufacturing overhead. But if you think you're going to get confused between the two, please write these down, and again, you can write these down in the index card that you bring for your exam too, just in case you need it. At this point, it is just a lot of words, but it will make a lot more sense when you do some problems. Let's take a look at a problem. We're going to calculate the standard cost for a Starbucks cup of coffee. Again, as you know, I'm going to make a lot of assumptions, but we assume that there's 1 cup of water, 1/8 cup cream, 5 teaspoons sugar, and 2 teaspoons coffee. That's all the ingredients in your basic Starbucks coffee. Now, again, we're calculating standard costs, so we also need to place a dollar amount. We assume that Starbucks can buy the cup of water for 1 cent, the cost of cup of water for is 1 cent. The cup of 1/8 cup of cream is 5 cents. 5 teaspoons sugar is 1 cent, and 2 teaspoons coffee costs them 7 cents. A total of 14 cents. That 14 cents is what we call the standard cost. Our standard cost consists of 2 components. There is a quantity standard and a price standard. The quantity standard states how much of each ingredient, each material is used, and the price standard says how much each item costs. So each item has a quantity standard and a price standard. If you notice all the ones that we've calculated so far, you notice that these are all direct materials. So next, we're going to calculate direct labor. Let's assume that it takes somebody 2 minutes to make this cup of coffee. They mix all the ingredients, pour the water, and stir it until that froth forms on the top. And this person who makes the coffee is paid $10 an hour, so we need to calculate how much 2 minutes of their time is worth. It would be $10 divided by 60 minutes multiplied by 2 minutes. That gives you roughly 33 cents a minute. Again, for our labor, this is direct labor, right? For our direct labor, we have a quantity standard. This is a quantity standard, and we have a price standard. So both direct material and direct labor have quantity standards and price standards when you calculate their standard cost. Calculating the manufacturing overhead standard is a little bit more complicated, so we're not going to take a look at it here. We'll take a look at it in the classroom. However, don't forget that the standard cost of this cup of coffee includes the cost of direct material, direct labor, plus the standard manufacturing overhead.